to Lancast. I'm your host, Danny Martin. My co-host Josh Gerber will join us a little later. But first, I want to give a little monologue. Last time we rebooted the show, and our main theme was our vision for America first, and the best vehicle for obtaining that vision for our country. And it occurred to me that a lot of people aren't going to necessarily get on board with that concept if, for example, they're not aware of what exactly the establishment is and what the components of the permanent unelected state are. And secondly, and tangential to that, they're never going to listen to what we have to say if they believe what they hear and read in corporate mainstream media and don't realize that it's controlled by some of those very components of the hidden permanent state. So today, we're going to talk about that, the establishment and the media that sustains it, that they are not your friend. That's the main theme today. Now, last time we talked a lot about the military-industrial complex, and I think I also mentioned career politicians. Well, I left out a lot of other entities that really comprise the forces that run our government that don't show up on a ballot. You know, there's the donor class, the think tanks, the lobbyists. Oh, and by the way, I highly recommend watching the Tucker Carlson episode from a couple months ago where he interviews Thomas Massie, one of our, in my opinion, the best person in Congress. But he gives a real eye-opening account about some of those lobbyists. But anyway, some other components. There's big tech, the medical industrial complex, and the revolving door between its regulatory agencies and big pharma. There's the big banks, aka Wall Street, big tech, and last but not least, the intelligence agencies, the three-letter agencies known as the CIA, the FBI, NSA, etc. And that's a lot to cover, but the first thing I want to do today is establish a starting point that everyone can agree on, no matter where you lean on the political spectrum. And that starting point is that these entities do exist and that they all have some influence on our politicians and our elections that are less than desirable, because we want our politicians to represent us and only us, don't we? Can we all agree on that? I think we can. The second starting point. I did an episode last fall called Lancaster's Propaganda, and it has turned out to be my most popular episode to date. So I'm going to do a little self-plug and encourage people to go listen to it. I talk about some of the propaganda techniques used by our local paper. Now, my thesis today is that this is a microcosm of the propaganda that goes on at the national level. So the second starting point I want everyone to get is, if in fact those establishment and permanent state entities are exerting control over media to the point where they're flat out lying to you, then they're not your friend. I think most people, if they're not already there, can get to that point. But see, I don't know if most people realize how pervasive it is. See, I'm not just talking about a couple network. I don't care whether it's CNN, MSNBC, or Fox, or one of the other network stations, and I don't care if it's NPR, the Washington Post, or the New York Times. They're all controlled behind the scenes, and some people may not aware or may not want to believe it. Where do I start? I mean, look, there's almost too much to cover for the amount of time I want to spend on this monologue, but I would suggest if you want to do a historical deep dive, start by reading Carl Bernstein's piece in a 1977 issue of Rolling Stone, back when that magazine was actually pretty good, where he talks about how the CIA had infiltrated newspapers like the New York Times. And also, look, if you're doing your own research, look into Operation Mockingbird from the Cold War. And again, this was a documented CIA propaganda program. But for more recent history, check out the work of, for example, Mike Benz, B-E-N-Z. He's a former State Department official and executive director of Foundation for Freedom Online. There's an excellent interview he gives on episode 75 of Tucker Carlson, where he talks about the advent of social media and the national security state's transition from being a force that, topples regimes overseas and suppresses free speech like they had a hand in doing that with the Arab Spring and with Crimea in 2014. So they transitioned from doing that overseas to leveraging those same skill sets domestically against our own people here in America. It's pretty mind-blowing, actually. Now, this information is already out there in many forms, if you know where to look, and I can't possibly articulate it as well as some of these other, podcasters can, and in the short amount of time that I want to talk about it. But I'm going to give you a shorter path you can take to comprehend this stuff and plug my favorite two podcasters. One is Dave Smith. He used to appear as a guest on Fox frequently, and he now hosts a show called Part of the Problem. He's probably the most articulate voice on the internet, in my opinion at least. Give him a listen. The other I recommend is Jimmy Dore, who used to be on the Young Turks, and he's a former Democrat. Now, neither of these guys is overtly partisan. One of them is a conservative libertarian, and the other is a classical liberal. But I recommend people out there, if you want to get a fresh perspective on things, try listening to people who are neither pro-Democrat or pro-Republican. Because these two guys, they're both anti-establishment, and they're wise to what's going on with our corporate media and our corrupt political system. Now, I want to call attention to a specific recent episode from each podcaster. Dave did an episode last week called "The Word of the Day is Weird," and it's about you ever notice how all the news agencies repeat the same things in exactly the same way? And he plays this video montage of all the talking heads on network news where that day they were talking about J.D. Vance and they were saying he's weird. And it's because they all get an email blast telling them their talking points for the day. And he verified this with an industry insider because he was connected to that. And that's just one example. Another is, and I'm sure you can find video montages online for this as well, but remember when everyone on TV was talking about ivermectin being a horse dewormer? It was absurd. I mean, we're talking about an award-winning drug that has been used to treat malaria and has had many uses for humans for many years. And now all of a sudden, its only value is as a horse dewormer. Now Dave kind of breaks down the psychology of this propaganda technique of repetition. A technique, by the way, I mentioned in my Lancaster's propaganda episode, but he mentions that unless you watch a video montage where all these different pundits are juxtaposed in one clip and you see the similarities, unless you watch it that way, you won't necessarily realize that this propaganda technique of repetition is being used on you. But anyway, check out the episode. And by the way, if you're a Democrat, don't be off-put because they're not defending J.D. Vance at all. They give their own assessment of why they think Vance is indeed weird. But at least they're giving their own original arguments. Now, the Jimmy Dore episode I want to call attention to came out just a couple days ago, and it's called "Democrats Are Now the CIA Party." And again, hear me out, Democrats, because I'm going to defend you all in a couple minutes. But look, this concept shouldn't be a surprise to anyone. We just talked about the CIA influence in media, and everyone knows, with the exception of Fox, that most of mainstream media leans in favor of the Democrats and is certainly hostile, at least towards Trump. But if you want to look at specific examples, I mean, number one, there's the whole Russia collusion hoax. The Democrats, how many intelligence agencies do they get to sign off on that? That was their invocation of authority, one of the techniques I mentioned in that episode. And, many of us knew that was bogus well before the Durham report came out. What else was there? Was the Hunter Biden laptop. I mean, which the media right before the 2020 election said, oh, hey, there's nothing to see here. This is just Russian disinformation. And our intelligence agency said so don't question that. Now, Ian Carroll, who's an independent investigative journalist, and Jimmy Dore, they have this interesting discussion about how it used to be the Republican Party that was more controlled by the CIA. And they speculated about when things flipped. Jimmy argues that it was the Obama presidency that really put the Democratic Party to sleep. It was certainly the point where they became the more aggressive warmongering party. If you consider Obama dropped more bombs than George W. Bush, expanding his wars from 4 to 7. His war making included the escalation of the war in Afghanistan, the destruction of Libya, and the destabilization of Syria. Obama also bailed out Wall Street after Citibank gave him a list of names of people who they wanted appointed to his cabinet, which he did. And that kind of fell under the radar for most Democrats because he was this great speaker. You have to admit, yeah, he was a charming guy. And he used the Espionage Act to prosecute more journalists than all his predecessors combined. So, this is the great Saint Obama that's been lionized by the left. And then Jimmy explains that it wasn't really Obama that started that shift, and then he goes into a little rant on how Clinton wasn't a friend of the working class either. Then Jimmy goes on to explain how Clinton passed NAFTA, which was terrible for American workers. He exploded the prison population, consolidated the media, and deregulated Wall Street. Now, Ian goes on to say some interesting things about Trump, and we're going to get to Trump in a little bit, but first, instead of telling you more about this episode, I want to play you a clip of Ian Carroll's theory about the flipping of the parties, because I can't possibly paraphrase it or articulate it the way he did.
But they do everything they can to try to disconnect us from the founding of the country, to try to make it feel like that's an outdated concept. And I have a theory that they realized somewhere in the Bush-Obama years, they realized that with the internet coming in, it's changing the nature of just society and civilization. And at some point, it really looks like they flipped from thinking like it used to be that the right was more controllable by these sort of like deep statey actors because the right was more aligned with corporations and more aligned with it was just easier to manipulate the right, and the left was so pro-free speech and anti-war that they were not pliable. But I think at a certain point they realized that the left, like inherent to liberal ideology, is this idea of the greater good. The whole point of like left and liberal thinking is that we work together to accomplish more for the greater good through government, versus like conservatives are like, no, leave me alone, do it the old way, and like individual liberty. And at a certain point, if you start to manipulate that concept of the greater good, you can get a lot done in the internet age, because you can start to create groupthinks. You can start to create this like mass psychosis that will force people to take an experimental medication against their will for the greater good.
Now, I want to validate Carroll's theory a little bit by reading to you some numbers from a Rasmussen poll from January 2022. It says that 29% of Democratic voters would support temporarily removing parents' custody of their children if parents refuse to take the COVID-19 vaccine. Nearly half, being 48% of Democratic voters, think federal and state governments should be able to fine or imprison individuals who publicly question the efficacy of the existing COVID-19 vaccines on social media, television, radio, or in online or digital publications. 45% of Democrats would favor governments requiring citizens to temporarily live in designated facilities or locations if they refuse to get a COVID-19 vaccine. Look, some of you are hearing this, and I know it's infuriating. And to be fair, there were a small percentage of Republicans who also supported those things. And I'm not trying to be divisive here. A lot of Republicans also cheerlead for the Iraq war, but the ones I trust the most now are the ones who are willing to admit that they did that and that they were wrong. Like Tucker Carlson, for example. And look, I get the appeal of just trusting the experts and being spoon-fed what to believe and who to support, because we all have busy lives and sometimes don't have the time to do our own research. And that's why I push back on the current Republican talking point that Democrats are the true threat to democracy, because, they're allowing their party elites right now to decide who their candidates are, and instead of having an actual vote by the people. As Josh and I talked about last episode, the Republicans essentially did the same thing in 2012. But also, there's an element of, it's just inherent in human nature, and it's not a good thing, but, my point is, I'm not passing judgment here. I recently read up on the Stanley Milgram Authority experiments of the 1960s and the Solomon Asch Conformity experiments of the 50s, and it kind of blew my mind. The Milgram experiments were intended to measure the willingness of study participants to obey an authority figure who instructed them to perform acts conflicting with their personal conscience. I'm reading this from online, the definition of the Milgram experiment. This is on the Wikipedia page. Participants were led to believe that they were assisting an unrelated experiment in which they had to administer electric shocks to a learner who was actually an actor. These sham or fake electric shocks gradually increased to levels that would have been fatal had they been real. Now, that's the end of the quote. Now, do you know how many subjects stopped before going to the maximum 450 volts? Only 35%. The other 65% just did exactly as they were told. They went the whole way. Now, the Solomon-Asch experiment, it's a little harder to describe without showing you, but picture a pair of cards. The card on the left has a solid line of a certain length drawn on it, and the card on the right has 3 solid lines of varying lengths, and only one of them is of matching length. Now, I watched a video of this, and what they did was they'd have a group of like 8 subjects in their experiments, but 7 of them were actually actors, and the 8th was a real subject who didn't know the others were actors. And what they'd do is the experimenter would hold up the 2 cards and go around the table and ask each subject which line in the card on the right was the one of matching length. Now, when I was watching this video, it was pretty easy to determine which one was the correct line. And with my bad eyesight, that's saying a lot. But what they did was, the first few rounds, everyone gave the right answer to the question before them, and this was kind of to establish a baseline of trust. But then they'd get to say round 4, and then all the actors who went before the real subject, when called upon, they would pick the wrong length line, and the purpose of the experiment was to measure if the actual subject would pick it too, or if they'd trust their own eyes and pick the correct one. Well, it turns out that 74% of the real subjects gave at least one incorrect answer, meaning only 26% were confident in their own answers to constantly and consistently defy majority opinion. And I was just astounded by what that says about human nature, how we're maybe hardwired not to go against the crowd, and how easy it is to manipulate and control people and get them to disbelieve their own eyes. Now with politics, it's even more pronounced because you factor in things like confirmation bias. People don't want to be taken out of their comfort zone. I'm going to shift gears for a minute because this is all tied together. But in the next segment, I want to address the Never Trump Republicans. Now, there's a recent article in the LNP about a former Republican committee chair. I don't want to mention her name, but the article kind of makes her the face of the Republicans for Harris group. I guess that's a thing. I don't know. But this whole story is almost too silly for me to dignify by talking about it. But I just wanted to mention it briefly because, they're clearly using the techniques of bandwagon fallacy and appeal to authority that I mentioned in that previous episode about propaganda. But the thing is, I know several people in real life who were lifelong Republican voters who absolutely hate Trump and are now presumably going to vote for Harris, even though they still align with Republican values. And these are all really nice people, and they're my friends. And look, if you're listening, I just want to say to you, I'm sorry, but you've been Milgrammed and ashed. You've been mashed. Maybe that'll be a new term that catches on. Look, I know you guys were big George W. Bush fans, and you don't like that Trump destroyed his brother Jeb on stage. And you guys probably respected the intelligence agencies and were against Trump because they were against Trump. But I'm sorry, Trump was right about Bush, and those agencies lied to you about WMDs. And they lied to you about Russiagate. They lied to you about him being friendly with dictators because they didn't like that he was actually attempting diplomacy and trying to make deals. They lied to you about fine people on both sides during the Charlottesville incident. They lied to you about drinking bleach. Those were all media talking points that have long been debunked. But by way of repetition in real life Asch Conformity, you've been trained to disbelieve your own eyes. And lastly, you've been lied to about the J6 and, what you call election denial. And this is the last point I want to make before I start to wrap up. There was an article in LNP from the July 31st in our words section, meaning it's directly from the editorial staff. And it's called Trust Our Elections. And here's a quote from it. The 2020 presidential election was legitimate and fair. Donald Trump and Mike Pence lost. Joe Biden and Kamala Harris won. Anyone who claims otherwise is either lying or has bought the lies told to them by bad actors." End quote. Now, what I find so reprehensible about this, it is their attempt to authoritatively squelch any dissent or even questioning of the official results. First of all, the words legitimate and fair are two entirely unrelated things, and they're doing a very subtle and manipulative thing here by putting the two together in this context. They're taking an objective term, legitimate, which, it was legitimate in the sense that these were the official results that had been rubber stamped by the current electoral structure, and they've not been overturned by our legal system. But that doesn't mean it was fair, which is a totally subjective term. What exactly was fair about covering for the Biden crime family and lying about Hunter's laptop as Russian disinformation right before the election? There are two ways to manipulate an election. One is changing the actual vote count. The other is telling lies and influencing people by withholding information so as to influence the outcome. They clearly did the latter. Now, as to the former, look, I'm not going to go there right now. I am suspicious about the statistical anomaly of why 18 out of 19 bellwether counties, which have proven to predict the winner correctly for decades, they all went to Trump, and yet he lost the election. But I'm not even talking about that. I'm just asking the question, is it reasonable with the still very new electoral landscape in which mail-in ballots play such a prominent role, is it reasonable to suspect, due to the legal nature of ballot harvesting, that there might be room for cheating and fraud, maybe enough to sway the outcome of an election in a pivotal swing state? And especially when emotions are so high, where a lot of people think, this guy is literally Hitler. I don't know, a lot of people, it's an ethical question. Would you cheat to prevent Hitler from rising to power? I think a lot of people would. So there was this survey done by the Heartland Institute and Rasmussen polls where 1 in 5 voters admitted to committing voter fraud in 2020. I want to quote the Washington Times. In an election where about 43% of voters used mail-in ballots, the highest percentage in U.S. history, 21% told the pollsters that they filled out a ballot in part or in full for a friend or family member. That is illegal in all states. And here's some more specifics from that survey. 17% of mail-in voters admit that in 2020 they voted in a state where they are no longer a permanent resident. 21% of mail-in voters admitted that they filled out a ballot for a friend or family member. 17% of mail-in voters said they signed a ballot for a friend or family member with or without his or her permission. 8% of likely voters say they were offered pay or a reward for voting in 2020. So I'm just reporting to you the survey results. You can do it what you want. I'm not claiming the election was stolen. I'm just asking questions and reading to you the results of this poll. So I'm going to move on, but the point is, it's totally reasonable to ask questions about the 2020 election, especially if we want to prevent any malfeasance in the upcoming election. And the point of LNP is just to get people to trust the experts and not ask the questions. So I want to wrap this up. The point of this whole monologue, and especially the last bit, isn't to get Republicans who weren't planning to vote for Trump to fall in line. I was a third-party voter for many years, and I hated that. Most of the time it was Democrats who were presumptuously doing that, as if their party was the lesser evil that I would have voted for if I hadn't voted third party. I haven't felt that way since the Bush years, I'll tell you straight up. But I digress. The point is, there are many media psyops that have hurt our country. The absolute biggest one over the last decade is the anti-Trump campaign that has led to the condition of TDS. And if you can cure TDS, you can cure people of any psyop. And this is especially important right now when the stakes are so high. There's turmoil in the Middle East, and we're only an incident away from World War III. I don't think that's hyperbole. These psyops are how the establishment manufactures consent for war. So there has never been a more important time to resist the psyops. Now, I've personally had many criticisms of Trump, but he was also the first president in 40 years to not get the U.S. involved in a new war. He's the guy willing to make a deal to end wars, and that's part of why the intelligence agencies and the war hawks hate him. They don't like making deals. He's also the guy who's at least trying to drain the swamp, quote unquote, but which you could argue he's going about it rather sloppily. And I have to admit, I don't understand his strategy, because he appointed some awful people to his cabinet last time. Pompeo, Bolton, Fauci. But the point is, even if he's able to make a small dent towards minimizing the degree of permanent state influence in our system, then no matter how you voted this election, your vote will actually count a little more next time. Because if he doesn't win, I guarantee you, both parties will become more emboldened to politically prosecute the other. Both parties' elites will become more brazen about choosing whoever they decide should be the candidate, not who the people want. And the CIA and other intelligence agencies will become more emboldened to interfere with that whole electoral process and to control our media. Look, I'm not asking people to change your vote. If you're not playing the long game, I get it. If you have other issues that are more important to you, that you feel directly impact your own life or that of your loved ones, I just want people to stop having TDS. You can hate Trump, but don't do it for the reasons media tells you. Trust your own eyes. Objectively compare his first term with the last 4 years. See politics through a clear lens, untarnished by media propaganda, which, as a reminder, is controlled by the corporate and permanent state that we've talked about, and that doesn't have your best interest at heart. And do it because nothing is as important as the truth. I'm now bringing out my co-host, Josh Gerber, who just listened to my whole monologue, and I want to get his input on this. So number one, Josh, what word should we settle on for, I was talking about at the very beginning, the swamp or the blob, the deep state, the establishment, permanent non-elected government. I think part of the problem is that, people don't know what we're talking about because it's so hard to define. So my question to you is, are we just doomed to use interchangeable and not universally definitive terms because of the hidden and somewhat amorphous nature of those interest groups?
Yeah, so I think it's best that we nail down one title for what we're up against, because the left has often been the kings and queens of titles and defining words and defining phrases, and I think we need to do the same, because they have had success, changing what words mean and what phrases mean presently and in the past. That's
a very good point. We need to own the language. They're masters of manipulating language.
Exactly.
So, what term are we going to go with then? Or do you have?
Me personally, I like the non-elected government workers one. I also like the term the fourth branch of government, because anyone who's educated in how our government's supposed to run, we have 3 branches of government, not 4. So I think just calling it the unconstitutional fourth branch of government is also a good option.
I like that. Fourth branch of government. Let's hope it catches on and we stay consistent with it. I'm going to move on. Okay, so are there any components of the fourth branch that I might have left out, or anything you'd like to elaborate on, or anything else really from the monologue that you have thoughts on?
I think overall the monologue was spot on, and there's not too much to add. I do think that we need to really, really stress that just because the nanny state has had benefits to our nation over the years and it's helped people doesn't mean that it's a good thing to have. And I don't think that replacing a left-wing nanny state with a right-wing nanny state, like some Republicans want to do,
exactly,
is any good. I don't think using the alphabet soup agencies, the FBI, the CIA, the Department of Education, I don't think the NIH, the CDC, I don't think turning those agencies into a right-wing agency is going to provide any more freedom to us.
No, it won't.
So I think instead of trying to change the nanny state, I think we need to shut it down.
Sounds good to me. Okay, next question. So at the end of my monologue, I kind of, I'll be honest, my intent was to try to cure TDS, which is kind of ridiculous. I mean, I felt like a cross between a magician. Like, for my next trick, I will cure TDS, or like a mad scientist or something, like, this is on par with curing cancer if it can be done. But, I mean, so that's my question to you. I mean, was it convincing? And do you think, TDS, Trump Derangement Syndrome, is that curable?
I don't think it's curable. But I also want to elaborate on Trump derangement syndrome. There's two sides of it, and I don't think people talk about the other one nearly as much. There's a positive Trump derangement syndrome as well, and that is the people in the MAGA movement who don't just see him as a man. They see him as some sort of deity or some sort of a messiah on high, and that he's going to solve all of our problems, and he's like the second coming of Abraham Lincoln or the second coming of George Washington or something like that. So I think it's more likely that the America First wing of the Republican Party can cure that side of Trump derangement syndrome, because we have the side that has actual thinkers in our camp.
Yes.
We have free-thinking people who will look at things and think critically for themselves. They won't listen to an expert, or they won't listen to a media head that's making millions of dollars to propagandize you like the left. So I think, the America First movement has an opportunity to cure Trump derangement syndrome in the Republican Party, and I don't think there's any hope in us trying to get rid of Trump derangement syndrome from the left. Mm-hmm. I think it's almost been a decade of him being called Hitler,
right?
Of him being called a misogynist, a rapist, a big orange man, a mean man, a cutthroat businessman, a traitor. I think there's been too many years of the media and politicians saying to their base that he's all those things for them to have an open thought to think, well, maybe he's not those things.
That's a really good point. It's almost like we have to, if you get repetition for all those years, it's almost like you have to have the same amount of repetition in the other direction. I can't wait to get my friend on here who's a trained hypnotist, because that's basically what's happened. Hypnotism through repetition in the media has caused people to have this way of thinking, and I don't see how to reverse that without the same amount of repetition in the other direction. And you made a good point. Like, it can go too far in the other direction. Like, we don't want to fall asleep and just entrust one politician to save us. That's a good point. So,
right, and sadly, I think a lot of good people are seeing Trump as a deity and the savior of the country. And I think that's equally as dangerous, because the establishment is basically using those people as foot soldiers to stay in power. The establishment is basically co-opting the passion and the love for this man to remain in power, in my opinion. Because the establishment, they're there forever. Trump is only going to be here for 4 more years.
Right.
And that's if he wins.
Yeah,
the establishment has always been able to be a leech on movements. And they find the next movement and they ride the next wave. And as long as they can control power, they're fine. Because they have no morals and they have no principle. All they care about is power. So sure, they'll ride the wave of Trump and the passions of people until he is gone, and then they'll jump on to the next one.
Yes. That's kind of the point of this whole episode. The establishment is not your friend, and unfortunately it's enduring beyond Trump, and that's something we need to fight against, basically. Yeah. I want to move on a little bit. Yeah, this is a different subject. There was a story last week, it was in the newspaper, that dozens of Pennsylvania National Guardsmen were deployed to the Middle East. And I mean, I know it happens all the time that they get deployed, but there were enough of them that it actually made the news, and it was kind of concerning because, there's so much turmoil in the Middle East right now. And I mean, do you think this indicates maybe we might be going to war soon? Or, I mean, it could just be another training thing. I don't know.
I know typically, they send so many Pennsylvania National Guardsmen overseas for training. But I also believe that the more military men and women that are sent overseas, the more and more we should worry about conflict and boil-over points between the Russian-Ukrainian war and the Middle East and Israel and America. Yeah. And also, I mean, our bases in the Middle East are getting shot at all the time.
Right.
And I mean, they're sitting ducks out there. And all it takes is one lucky terrorist organization to get lucky and hit a base, and we're back into a hot conflict in the Middle East.
Exactly. That's what I said earlier. We're only one incident away from getting involved in another war, a full-blown war with our troops. I want to use this opportunity, I think I've talked about it before in the show, but to plug the Defend the Guard bill. I hope we get it passed in Pennsylvania. This is a state-level legislation that would protect our National Guardsmen. This would prevent them from being deployed overseas unless it's specifically for a training mission. There would have to be for Congress to pass a formal declaration of war before they could be deployed overseas to a combat zone. That's what the bill is, and it's been introduced in at least 30 different states. And I've been working with our legislators trying to get it introduced in Pennsylvania. Hopefully we'll have a change of guard of new state representatives soon.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, especially here in the 96th.
I think the state that has had the most success, I believe, is I think it's Montana and then Arizona. Arizona, the news broke last year that the Senate actually passed Defend the Guard.
Right.
And they had a massive phone banking operation, and it passed. And then the Speaker of the House of Arizona basically let it die. He basically didn't bring it up for a vote. So there's plenty of work to be done. I know in Pennsylvania, I've talked to my state rep, Tom Jones, and he's brought it up to anti-war Democrats, and he's brought it up to some constitutional Republicans in the Freedom Caucus, and some of them like it. Some of the Freedom Caucus people are still a little war hawkish for my blood, and they think war is something to defend. So we still have a lot of work to do in Pennsylvania. I think there's a lot of money made sending our National Guardsmen over to Lithuania and to the Middle East. So I think it's a long road ahead, and it's kind of like an educational thing, more so than anything that we're going to get done anytime soon.
Yeah, I think you're right, and we're just going to keep chipping away and keep plugging it in the meantime. Yeah, thanks for that update. Last question before we wrap up here. So, since the last time we spoke, Kamala Harris picked her vice president. I can't even remember his name now. Walz? Anyway, so, I don't have a lot to say about, that other podcasters have already covered him, but My question to you is, do you still think it's not going to be her on the ticket? Because I personally, I don't see, they've spent all this energy like hyping up Kamala, and like, you know, they've got Bon Iver like having these concerts to make it look like she has all these followers. It seems like a very well thought out campaign by the powers that be to make her seem like the greatest thing since sliced bread without, as Tim Pool pointed out, like she doesn't even have a platform yet. It's kind of ridiculous. But anyway, my question is, do you still think it's going to be her, like these two people on the ballot?
It's not over till the fat lady sings.
Okay.
I understand the unlikelihood of it being anyone else, but I also think we need to sit back and just watch what they're doing. She hasn't had a press conference. They haven't really allowed her to speak. Like, she doesn't have a platform. She's had minuscule rallies, and she's had to bring in celebrities like Megan Thee Stallion to come out and twerk to get people to come into her rallies. There's been photoshops of people coming to a rally. Have you seen that?
Yeah, I've seen all kinds of shit.
That's crazy. That's crazy. If you zoom in on that photo, there's some really it's definitely Photoshop from what I can see. From what I can see, it's Photoshop. Because if you would zoom in on that photo, you can see people with their phones out, you know, recording. Mm-hmm. And there's some guys recording a sunset. And it's the middle of the day. Like, on his phone, he's supposed to be recording her, right? And it's a sunset.
That's pretty funny. The term Photoshop almost seems antiquated now because we've got like AI.
Well, I guess it's AI.
Yeah.
I guess it's AI. It's not Photoshop.
Okay.
But like, I don't really. I think this is a great way for them to pump money into the campaign, and people keep on talking about the money. It's really not that hard to donate money from one failed campaign to another. When I lost my state house race, I had roughly $200 and some odd left that I didn't spend, and when I was running for state rep, and I basically signed a paper and donated it to the Libertarian Party of Lancaster County. It's not hard. It's not hard to reallocate money from one person, from one campaign to another, or donate that money to a super PAC. It's really not that simple. It's really that simple. Sorry.
Gotcha.
So yeah, I think there's still a chance that it's going to be someone else, just because she hasn't had an interview yet. She's kind of hiding in the basement with the media.
Right.
And Waltz has kind of blown up in their faces, in my opinion, because he always gloated himself as like he served in the military, which he did.
Right.
But he never went to a combat zone.
Right. Yeah. I think there's a lot of scandals that are going to come out besides that one that's already come out. Right.
Right. So I'm still not sold on it. I'm probably a little more conspiratorial than other people just because it's fun.
Sure.
It's just fun to talk about, things that could be or may be.
Right.
So I don't know. I will be interested to see what happens at the convention and see if it's really her or not.
Yeah, can't wait to see what happens. Interesting times. All right. Well, thanks, Josh, for joining us remotely today. And that's going to be a wrap for our show. Thanks, everyone, for listening. Take care. If you would like to be a guest on Lancast or contact us for any reason, send an email to lancastAmericaFirst@gmail.com. That's Lancast with 2 C's, AmericaFirst@gmail.com. Thank you.